The day everything fell apart. Lily Anderson had spent her entire morning arranging white roses in crystal vases throughout the marble hallways of their estate on Ridgewood Drive in Connecticut. She wore a pale pink dress that highlighted her glowing pregnancy and stood before the mirror in their master bedroom, admiring how motherhood seemed to be painting her life with new colors. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden shadows across the mahogany furniture, and she smiled, thinking about how perfectly everything was falling into place. Her husband, Drew, had promised to be home early today so they could discuss baby names and finalize the nursery design. She imagined his strong arms around her as he pressed his face against her swollen belly, feeling their child kick against his palms. But Drew arrived home with a darkness in his eyes that she had never seen before. She heard his car pull into the circular driveway, and her heart began to race, sensing something was terribly wrong. He entered the house without greeting her and went directly to his study, slamming the door. She followed him upstairs, her hand instinctively protecting her unborn child, and asked him what was happening, but he refused to meet her eyes. When she pushed him for answers, he finally looked at her with an expression of such coldness that she felt her knees weaken. He told her that he had made a terrible mistake and that he could not be the man she needed him right now. His words came out like chunks of ice, each one landing in her chest with brutal precision. Lily begged him to sit down and talk with her, to work through whatever was troubling him, but he was already throwing clothes into a designer luggage case, moving with the efficiency of someone who had planned this moment for weeks. She reached out to touch his arm, but he jerked away from her, as if her touch had burned him. The telephone in the study rang and he answered it, whispering urgently to whoever was on the other end, while she stood frozen in the doorway, her hand frozen on the door frame, unable to process what was happening around her. Within minutes, he was telling her they were going for a drive, that they needed to clear their heads and talk about their future. She trusted him then. Even now, she could not understand why she had trusted him, but she did. They drove through the winding suburban roads in his sleek black Mercedes, and she watched the passing landscape, wondering when everything had become so complicated. He kept his eyes locked on the road, refusing to engage in conversation. She tried again to ask him what was wrong, told him that whatever it was, they could work through it together, but he remained silent. His jaw was clenched, and his hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly, his knuckles turned white. After what felt like an eternity, he pulled the car over onto a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but overgrown trees and empty fields. The sudden stop jolted her forward, and she braced herself against the dashboard. "Get out," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. She stared at him, thinking surely he was joking, but his expression did not waver. "I cannot do this anymore," he continued. "I cannot be responsible for you and the baby. Not now. Not like this." His words hung in the air between them, suffocating her. She was pregnant. She was helpless. She was terrified. Drew would not look at her, would not acknowledge her pleas. He simply sat there staring straight ahead as if she were already gone. She opened the car doors slowly, expecting him to stop her, to tell him he was joking, but nothing came. She stepped out onto the gravel shoulder, still holding on to hope that this was some kind of cruel test, but he simply drove away, leaving her standing alone on the highway in her pale pink dress, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby growing inside her. A savior appears. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, when Lily finally allowed herself to truly understand that Drew was not coming back. She had been standing on the side of the highway for what felt like hours, her feet aching in her designer heels, and her heart shattered into pieces so small she wondered if she would ever be able to put them back together. A few cars had passed by her, but no one stopped, and she was too shocked to even try to flag them down to ask for help. Her mind kept replaying his words over and over again, each repetition driving the knife deeper into her soul.
She thought about calling someone but realized she had no phone, no purse, no identification, nothing that could connect her to the life she once knew. The sky had turned a deep purple when headlights appeared in the distance, approaching slowly. She stood up straighter, wiping the tears from her face, trying to compose herself, but her body was shaking uncontrollably. The black Mercedes that pulled over next to her did not belong to Drew, but to someone far more powerful, far more connected to her life than she realized. Thomas Hart stepped out of the vehicle with urgency in his movements. His silver hair caught the fading light, and his steel-gray eyes scanned her face with immediate concern. He had been driving this exact route to meet with a client when he saw a woman in a pale pink dress standing alone on the highway. Something in his chest told him to stop. "Lily." Thomas said her name like a prayer, like he was thanking the universe for answering his call. His voice was deep and warm, carrying the weight of decades of business dealings and life experience. She fell into his arms, sobbing against his chest, and he held her without asking questions, without demanding explanations. He simply held her, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life, as if some part of his soul had always known that she would need him in this devastating way. Thomas had been a father figure to her since she was a child, guiding her through her parents' divorce and through the complicated years of growing up. He had walked her down the aisle when she married Drew, had congratulated her when she announced her pregnancy, but he had never seen her like this, broken and abandoned. He guided her gently into his car, wrapping his expensive cashmere coat around her shoulders. She sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window, unable to find words for what had happened. Thomas did not press her for details. Instead, he drove toward his penthouse apartment in Manhattan, speaking softly about nothing important, about the weather, about a restaurant he wanted to take her to, about anything except the devastation she was clearly experiencing. She appreciated his silence, his patience, his willingness to simply be present without needing answers immediately. As they drove through the night, Lily felt something shifting inside her, a strange sense of security mixing with her overwhelming grief. Thomas had always been there for her, and now, in her darkest moment, he was here again, like a guardian angel descending from the heavens. When they arrived at his apartment, she was struck by its beauty. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, the elegant contemporary furniture, the sense of safety and permanence that radiated from every corner. Thomas showed her to the guest bedroom and helped her settle in, making sure she had everything she needed. He ordered soup from her favorite restaurant and sat with her while she ate, even though she could barely swallow. He did not ask about Drew, did not ask what happened. He simply existed in her space, letting her know that she was no longer alone. Thomas Hart had entered her life once again, this time as something more than a godfather, something deeper and more complicated than either of them could have anticipated.
Shelter in the storm. Days turned into weeks, and Lily began to understand that her old life was truly over. The penthouse became her sanctuary, her refuge from a world that suddenly felt hostile and dangerous. Thomas insisted she rest, that she focus entirely on her pregnancy and her emotional recovery. He hired the best obstetrician in the city to ensure that both she and the baby were healthy, and he never once made her feel like a burden, even though she carried the weight of that guilt constantly. She tried to thank him repeatedly, but he would dismiss her gratitude with the gentle smile and a wave of his hand, telling her that family took care of family, that there was nothing to thank him for. One evening, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Lily sat on the terrace of the penthouse, watching the sunset paint the Manhattan skyline in brilliant colors. Thomas joined her with 2 glasses of sparkling cider, and they sat in comfortable silence for a long time. She had begun to notice things about him that she had never allowed herself to see before. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands when he reached out to steady her as her pregnancy made movement increasingly difficult. The gentleness in his voice when he spoke to her, the genuine love that seemed to radiate from his entire being. She felt something unfamiliar stirring inside her, something that felt like betrayal and guilt mixed with a longing she could not name. "I never thanked you for saving my life," Lily said, breaking the silence. Thomas turned to look at her, and in his eyes, she saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering against her cheek. "I have been waiting for you to understand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that you were never really lost. I have always been here, watching over you, protecting you, even when you did not know you needed protecting." His words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning and emotion that went far beyond the relationship they had always maintained. Lily felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were not tears of grief or despair. They were tears of confusion and awakening. She had spent so many years seeing Thomas as a father figure that she had missed what was standing right in front of her. A man who had arranged his entire life around her happiness. A man who had sacrificed his own romantic pursuits to be available whenever she needed him. A man who loved her in a way that transcended the boundaries they had always maintained. She stood up from the chair, unable to sit still under the weight of this revelation, and walked to the edge of the terrace, looking out at the glittering city below. "I do not deserve your kindness," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I came to you broken and damaged, carrying another man's child, and you took me in without hesitation. You have been nothing but patient and caring, and I have done nothing but mourn what I lost instead of appreciating what I have found." Thomas stood and joined her at the railing, his presence beside her grounding her in the present moment. "You deserve everything, Lily," he said softly. "Everything that is good and beautiful and true in this world. You deserve a man who will never abandon you, who will cherish every moment with you, who will love your child as his own." As he spoke these words, Lily realized that he was not speaking hypothetically. He was speaking about himself and about the future that had been quietly unfolding between them all along.
The return of the past. 6 months had passed since Lily arrived at Thomas Hart's penthouse, and she was now 8 months pregnant, with a glow that seemed to radiate from deep within her soul. She had begun to allow herself to dream about a future with Thomas, a future that included their shared love for each other and his unwavering commitment to raise her child as his own. They had not officially become lovers, but their connection had deepened into something far more intimate than physical touch. They spent their evenings reading together on the terrace, discussing philosophy and life and dreams, and late one night, under a blanket of stars, Thomas had kissed her softly on the forehead and told her that he would wait for her, for as long as it took, until she was ready to be his completely. The peace that Lily had finally found shattered like glass when Drew Anderson arrived at Thomas Hart's office building, with flowers in his hands and desperation etched across his face. He had spent months searching for his wife, tracking down her location through mutual friends and private investigators, and when he finally discovered that she was living with Thomas Hart, he felt a rage so consuming that it threatened to burn him from the inside out. Drew that realized too late what he had thrown away. He had ended his affair quickly, realizing that the woman who had seduced him held no candle to the beauty and grace of his wife. He had tried to contact Lily through their attorneys, through mutual friends, through any channel available, but she had blocked his calls and refused to acknowledge his existence. Now facing the reality that she had moved on, that she had found comfort in the arms of another man, he was willing to fight for her with everything he had. Thomas sat across from Drew in his office, a place of power and authority where countless business deals had been negotiated and won. But this was not business, this was personal. Drew spoke with a desperation that bordered on madness, telling Thomas that he had made a terrible mistake, that he loved his wife, that he wanted to come home to his family, and that Thomas had no right to interfere in the life they had built together. Thomas listened quietly, his expression unreadable, as Drew laid bare his regrets and his longing and his promises to be a better man. Thomas then calmly explained that Lily was no longer the woman who had married Drew, that she had grown and evolved and discovered her own strength, that she had learned she was worthy of so much more than the crumbs he was offering her as reconciliation.
A choice between two hearts. Lily sat on the edge of the sofa in Thomas Hart's penthouse apartment, listening to Drew plead his case with a heart that felt torn in two directions. She looked at the man she had married, the father of her unborn child, and tried to reconcile the man standing before her with the cold, cruel stranger who had abandoned her on a desolate highway. 6 months ago, his words would have melted her resistance, would have broken through all her defenses. But now she possessed a strength that had been forged in the fires of betrayal and nurtured by Thomas's unconditional love. Drew told her that he had spent every day since their separation regretting his decision, that the affair had meant nothing, that he had been lost and confused and terrified of impending fatherhood, that his abandonment of her had been the biggest mistake of his life. She listened as he painted a picture of a reconciliation, describing how they could rebuild their marriage, how he would be the man she deserved, how they could be a family again. He promised to go to therapy, to work through his insecurities, to be present for the birth of their child, to never leave her side again. His words were honey-sweet and seductive, and part of her wanted to believe him, because that would mean returning to the familiar, returning to the life she had always known. But another part of her, the part that had been awakened by Thomas's love, knew that going back to Drew would be a betrayal of everything she had learned about herself, about her worth, about her capacity to be loved in a way that was pure and true and unconditional. When Thomas arrived home 2 hours later, he found Lily alone on the terrace, her eyes red from crying, her hands clutching a cup of tea that had long grown cold. He immediately sensed what had happened, and he did not attempt to hide the pain that flickered across his face. She told him everything: Drew's arrival, his pleas, his promises, his tears, and as she spoke, she watched Thomas's expression carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. He did not interrupt her, did not demand that she turn Drew away, did not try to convince her of what he wanted her to do. Instead, he sat beside her and took her hands in his. "You must make this choice for yourself," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I will not influence you. I will not tell you what to do, even though it will destroy me to lose you. I have spent my entire life putting your happiness before my own, and I will not stop doing that now, even if it means setting you free to return to the life you once knew." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, Lily saw the profound depth of his love, the sacrifice he was willing to make for her well-being. Lily felt something crystallize inside her in that moment. She realized that love was not about grand gestures or passionate promises. Love was about showing up. Love was about patience and sacrifice. Love was about accepting someone's entire self, including their imperfections and their fears. Thomas had shown her what true love looked like, and she could never go back to anything less. She stood from her chair and looked toward the city lights, and then back at Thomas with absolute certainty burning in her eyes. She told him that she had made her decision, that she was choosing him not because she was running away from Drew, but because she was running toward the future they could build together. She was choosing the man who had never abandoned her, the man who had loved her through her darkest moments, the man who wanted to be a father to her child. Thomas pulled her into his embrace and kissed her forehead, and then her cheeks, and finally her lips, with a tenderness that spoke of years of longing and patience rewarded. She felt their baby kick between them, and she laughed through her tears, realizing that this child would know true love from the moment of birth, would grow up surrounded by the kind of devotion and commitment that she had only recently come to understand. The next morning, Lily called Drew and told him that while she would never deny him access to his child, she could not and would not reconcile with him. She had chosen a different path, a path toward genuine love and healing and hope. 2 months later, Lily gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Emma, and Thomas was there, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement and love. When the nurse placed the tiny infant in his arms, tears streamed down his face as he looked at the daughter he had chosen to love as his own. He looked at Lily with such profound gratitude and adoration that she knew without any doubt that she had made the right choice. Drew came to meet his daughter, and while he loved her deeply, he also came to understand that some chances, once lost, cannot be reclaimed. Lily and Thomas built a life together filled with love and trust, and the kind of security that comes from knowing you are truly cherished. As she held her daughter in her arms and felt Thomas's strong presence beside her, Lily realized that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about finding your soulmate, but about allowing yourself to see the one who has been there all along.